Well, when did it happen? Let me immediately discount a kind of general belief that this comes from the dark medieval times. No, it doesn't. It comes from around 1604, 1605, 1520. There were, of course, always people doing magic in every society. We know it in indigenous societies, in European societies, in South American societies. There are always people engaged in various forms of magic: white magic, black magic, healing, harming. Right? And so there was in Europe as well. But something changed. Something changed in the 15th century. Around 1400 to 1430, 1440, people, you ask who people? Okay, theologians, lawyers, judges, began looking at this kind of activity and these kind of people who engaged in, for instance, healing and harming through the use of maybe herbs, through the use of stones, through the use of various kinds of charms, right? Even using church blessings, but they weren't church authorities, they weren't priests, they were just lay people, men and women, but more women. And they began trying to analyse what was this about. And it's not as though they did this for the first time, but they began constructing theories that these people do this together with the help of the devil, under the guidance of the devil, and they're part of a big group. Witchcraft is about group magic or group sorcery. Not in every case, but in almost all cases. It's implied or it's explicit. It's implicit or explicit that they're somehow part of a larger group which is being controlled and manipulated, being orchestrated by demonic agents, by devils, right, in the Christian belief. So this began, and we can kind of almost pinpoint it to the parts of Western Switzerland, northwestern Italy, that kind of corner of the Western Alps, in around 1400 to 1440, that period of time. And they began writing then treatises to demonstrate this, to prove this. Right? And they became influential, and you suddenly had what you might call mass trials, but small mass trials of maybe 10 people, 15 people. People who previously had been called just heretics were now being typified as witches. Not only did heretics, say, meet at night in secret places, but now they met on tops of hills. They met together with the devil. They met and they engaged in terrible sorts of things. They began to meet, they began to consort with devils, they began to make pacts with devils. In other words, a kind of contract and agreement that if the devil would give them certain things, they would go out and do the devil's work. And sometimes they would have also sexual contact and sexual relations with devils and also with each other. And also, terrible, with those of the same sex, right? So they were suddenly homosexual as well. So, and engage in cannibalism. So whatever you could think of, began to be added on to ensure that people were aware that these were the most terrible, decrepit, loathsome human beings you could imagine. We know that from other periods of history and other times, that this is what one does when one scapegoats particular groups of people. Even though we can date this around the 1420s, 1430s, it began to make some impact, but only in small parts of Europe. It was really from about 1560 through to about 1660 that you had the largest number of trials. And most of them were in what at that time was called the Holy Roman Empire, which was essentially Germany, but parts of Poland, parts of eastern France, especially Lorraine, those who know it, the city of Nancy and that kind of area, where about 50% of the trials that occurred in that particular region. But then also in other parts of Europe, I'll come to that in a moment. So it was that period from about 1560 to 1660. And the greatest number of trials and executions occurred in the period from about 1590 to 1630. So for virtually all this period, except for maybe that initial period around the 1430s, 40s, we're talking about the period of the Renaissance. We're talking about the period of the scientific revolution. We're talking about the period of, not quite, but almost, by 1660, the beginnings, the early Enlightenment, as we called it. We're not talking about the Middle Ages. This is something which happens much after that. And most of those treatises that I referred to were written from the period from about 1580 to 1660. Witches are related in all kinds of ways to various disasters, especially storms, right? Storms, hail, lightning, the disaster that brings, and we know in an Australian context what kind of a disaster it does bring. We've had our floods and our cyclones and so on. And this kind of thing happens in Europe, as you know, either from your direct experience or reading it in the newspapers all the time. And it did so even more at that time, but I'll come back to that. They're blamed especially for fires, and in the period we're talking about, much of the architecture, certainly in villages but also in towns, was made from wood, and therefore villages just went up. The whole village went up. A fire began and it went through the whole village. You know, it was similar to our experience of the bushfire. Very destructive fires. I mean, just think of the Great Fire of London of 1666, for instance. Witches were constantly blamed for shipwrecks. I mean, there are numerous cases of this. Bad weather at sea, shipwrecks. A famous case is King James I, when he was picked up his bride-to-be in Denmark and was going back to Scotland. They had a terrible storm. They thought that the ship would be ruined and they would drown. Fortunately, they weren't, but who did he blame? He blamed witches. Witches had brought that about. There were also plague, just as a few hundred years beforehand. In particular, Jews were blamed for plague. In the period we're talking about, in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, the 15th to the 17th centuries, it was witches who were blamed for plague. And there were many plagues at this period. There were continuations of the Black Death that we know about, but also cases of other kinds of epidemics that swept Europe. And very often witches were blamed in the same kind of way as spreading poisons on the lintels of houses, and that would contaminate the inhabitants of those houses. Witches were poisoners. And then one other thing that they were blamed for was infertility, impotence, and connected with that, sexual disorder. The fact that the crops didn't grow, that animals didn't give birth, and also that human beings, men and women, were infertile, were impotent, and couldn't have children. They were also associated with death. Very often when you see images of witchcraft, as you do here, and I'll point some out soon in a moment, you'll see skulls, bones. Witches are on the edge of life and death. That's one of their powers. First of all, that they can move people onto the other side. They kill, they maim, they bring sickness, but also that they can cross the other side. And as a couple of the images here, especially the one down there of the Witch of Endor, is an example of a whole range of images where they cross to the other side. They live in the world of spirits. They communicate with spirits, for good or for ill. And this is the same. Remember, witches can heal. That's why they can also kill. Witches were seen more and more commonly as an example of the end of the world. This was the ultimate terror. There were not only these terrible things going on in the world like war and epidemics, plague and various kinds of natural disasters, and of course there were many, floods, earthquakes, the kinds of things we experience today. That was happening at that time as well. But now we had these witches, and why? Why then were witches such a sign? They were a sign because they were, if you like, the front troops. They were the assistants of the devil in the world. And you couldn't tell who was a witch and who wasn't. And that was one of the, so they were kind of fifth column. If you think back to the McCarthy period and so on, they were a fifth column in our midst, and you couldn't know who was a witch and who isn't. You didn't know until they came out. They were sort of, or another term, they were sleepers. You know, the term that spies use. They were sleepers in our community, and then they would strike at particular points of time. So I think, and also the language of terrorism uses that as well. I mean, you know the stories of some of the fears that have been created about refugees, that they're terrorists, they're sleepers. 5 or 10 years down the track, they will show their true colours. And I thought I'd just really draw to your notice at the moment, but it's something that I think you should look at later. But for instance, these two wonderful De Gein pieces that the National Gallery has. First of all, this one, which is called Preparations for a Witch's Sabbath, which I'm not sure if it's correct, but that's the common title that it's been given. But there you can see how in the foreground you see a number of witches together. They're doing something in a pot with potions. They're creating their poisons. They're creating their particular creams, their salves as they're often called, to rub on people or to rub on objects and to bring about kind of destruction and death. And in the background, on the ground, you see all sorts of things, intimations of death. You see actually the lower torso of a woman or the buttocks of a woman, nothing else. You can see a skull, a severed head, bones. This is all about death. This is all about destruction. And up in the sky, in this extraordinary sky of black clouds, which are absolutely dripping. They're dripping with liquid substances. And it's through those clouds that the witches and other spirits ride their particular animals and so on. And in the middle, right in the middle of the print, you can see a lightning strike, right? And this is what the witches bring about. They bring about this total disorder in nature. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this from having read Shakespeare and others. When terrible things happen on earth, they also happen right through the cosmos. There's disorder, right? Here we have a scene of witches and death. This scene, I see it as a kind of counter Pietà. You know, the Pietà with the Virgin, with Christ's body, the Virgin lamenting about the body of her Son who has been crucified and is now to be lain in a tomb. Here, together with Mary Magdalene and the other women who follow Christ to Golgotha, to the scene of the crucifixion. Here you have a scene of three women that look nasty. They're not lamenting, but they seem to be extracting something out of the mouth of this male figure. Now, if you know Duchesne's other work, he has similar scenes to this, where there is a body, a corpse, which is partly dismembered, which is partly opened up, and various organs are being taken out of it. Here they're doing it, and they're taking out these organs to create their particular potions and creams and salves and so on to do their terrible work. And it's kind of repulsive in many ways, but I think this is what it is. It's based on the Pietà, if you like, but it's an anti-Pietà. It really communicates the savagery, the nastiness, the lack of humanity, the callousness and lack of any empathy on the part of this class of human being that are called witches. So they are the ultimate other. They're the ultimate, the opposite end of what humanity should be.